Welcome, everyone. My name is Jennifer Houston. I'm a cattle producer and operate a livestock auction market with my family in East Tennessee. I also serve as the president-elect of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association this year. I'm pleased to welcome you to the third webinar in our series focused on genetic selection. We are proud to be partnering on this series with the eBeef Cattle Genetics team, beef cattle genetics experts from universities across the country. As a participant, your line will be muted, but feel free to type in questions in the question box on your screen during the webinar, and at the end of the presentations, the team will answer as many as time will allow. If you have trouble with your technology, or if you are joining us only for the audio, the webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing in a few days at ncba.org. Just look for the Producer Education tab on the website. Webinar tonight, The 4 S's of Crossbreeding, will be led by Dr. Bob Weber, Professor and Beef Extension Specialist at Kansas State University, and Dr. Megan Rolfe, Assistant Professor of Genetics, also at K-State. And I believe Dr. Rolfe will be starting things off tonight. So Megan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, thanks to all of you that have tuned in tonight to get some information on crossbreeding. And we're going to be using a polling system tonight, which is going to be the same type of system that was used in the previous two presentations. So if you were tuned in for those, it's going to be the same sort of approach. So basically, if you want to pull out your phones, you can text the letter EPDs to number 22333. And once you get logged in, you'll get a text message back that you've joined this particular session. So if you want to go ahead and pull those out and get logged in, that would be great. And then you'll be able to participate for the rest of the presentation. And to get us kicked off, we just kind of have a sample question here. So the directions again are at the top. You can text in EPDs to 22333. And then you'll be able to text in these numbers to respond to the polls. So we're going to give everybody a little bit of time to get logged in, and it looks like we've got a few results coming in, so great. And basically, we're just asking a demographic question. Just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're trying to accomplish in your operation. Another few seconds here. Okay, if you're still responding, feel free to go ahead and do so. We're going to go ahead and show the chart. Looks like we have a lot of commercial producers in the audience tonight, and also quite a few seed stock producers. So that's fantastic. So let's go ahead and kick off the presentation here with a question.
So this is Bob Weber, and welcome everybody to tonight's program. We're sure glad you've decided to join us for a little bit of information on crossbreeding. And our first polling question related to the talk really is, what are the benefits of crossbreeding as you see it? So you can respond A, B, or C, or D there. Breed complementarity for A, excuse me, heterosis, both breed complementarity and heterosis. Or lastly, D, I don't think there are any benefits. We'll give you just a minute here, and everybody's getting quicker, I can tell already. Yeah, go ahead. All right, so about 10% of you responded breed complementarity, about 20% just heterosis, and then C here, both breed complementarity and heterosis were the overwhelming majority here, and still a few of you coming in, almost 3/4 picked option C. And Megan, there aren't any non-believers with us tonight. So that's good news, I guess. Tell us why might we think about crossbreeding as a tool to improve production efficiency in beef cattle?
Well, the benefits of crossbreeding can really be summarized by sort of two main categories. And the first of those, is our audience knows, is heterosis. So heterosis really refers to the advantages in production that we see in over the average of the performance that we would expect from two purebred lines. And that advantage is due to heterosis. And we'll talk a little bit about that later in the presentation. So the second advantage is related to breed complementarity, where we're really trying to take two different breeds and match them up to complement each other's strengths and weaknesses. So to kick off this discussion, let's start with a statement that I've heard a lot of times. And that is that crossbreeding leads to large increases in birth weight of calves. So let's kick that out to the audience. So what do you guys think? Is that a true statement or is that a false statement? So if you think we do get large increases in birth weights of calves due to crossbreeding, click A. And if you think that we don't get large increases in birth weights of calves, go ahead and select option B. We'll give you a few seconds to respond here. Okay, looks like we've got a few responses, so let's take a look at the results. Wow, we can see that most of our audience thinks that statement is not true. Bob, why don't you tell us a little bit about how big the effect actually is?
Sure, thanks, Megan. So one of the things that I think is, as a researcher, really interesting about the idea or concepts around crossbreeding and exploiting the tools of heterosis is that researchers have worked at this for a long time, and one of the most maybe interesting things is the Meat Animal Research Center collects data on an annual basis regarding a variety of the major U.S. beef breeds and their crosses. And Dr. Matt Spangler, one of our partners, Megan, in the e-beef group, had a graduate student here 2 or 3 years ago, worked through that data at the Meat Animal Research Center, which now numbers somewhere around 25,000 or more breedings or calves represented in the data, to re-estimate sort of the heterosis effects for birth weight, weaning weight, and yearling weight data for really 3 different crossing combinations. So British by British breed crosses, British by continental breed crosses, or continental by continental. And what he found was actually that in some cases, the heterosis estimates compared to maybe some of the benchmark data from the 1990s or early 2000s has actually gotten a little bit bigger. But what we expect is somewhere around about 1/2 to 3/4 of a kilogram, so maybe 1 pound to 1.5 pounds of additional birth weight due to heterosis. As you look across the screen, though, you find substantially larger increases, of course, for weaning weight and yearling weight. So as you can see, those increases for birth weight aren't very big, and you and the audience are tuned to that, and that's great.
So we can see some effects of heterosis. So what actually is heterosis? So some of you may have heard heterosis referred to as hybrid vigor, but really it's about the superiority of a crossbred animal as compared to the average of its straightbred parents. So let's look at that graphically to give a good example here. So on the left of your screen, we've got the performance of the mean for breed A, and we've got the mean performance for breed B on the right-hand side of your screen. And what you see is that the expected performance of an AB crossbred progeny would be where we see that dashed line in the center of that figure. And in reality, what actually happens a lot of the time is that the performance will actually be slightly better than what we would expect from that mean. And the difference from the mean and what we actually see in terms of performance, we can attribute to heterosis. And typically when we think about heterosis, the more divergent the parental breeds are, or the more different that they are in terms of ancestry, the more heterosis we would expect to get from that particular mating. And heterosis is also influenced by the heritability of traits, which we'll talk about a little bit later tonight. So we know what heterosis is. So let's talk a little bit about the origins of heterosis. So I typically think of heterosis as being derived from when we have alleles from two different breeds being paired together in an offspring. So if we think about an example where we have an Angus bull here on our left, his chromosomes are all Angus chromosomes because he's purebred. So all of those 4 pairs of chromosomes we've got colored in black on this slide. So the female in question here is going to be a simmental. And so we've represented simmental chromosomes in red. So she's got 4 pairs of those red simmental chromosomes. If we make that mating and we look at the progeny, the F1 progeny, this Sim Angus cow here on the right-hand side of the slide, what we see is that we got 1 set of chromosomes from that Angus bull and 1 set of chromosomes from the simmental female. And so at every place in the genome here, we have Angus alleles at the same place in the genome as we have simmental alleles. And that's really where that heterosis is derived from. So anytime we have those chromosomes of different colors coming together, we see heterosis in that progeny. So we now know what heterosis is and where it originates. Bob, have you heard any common statements about heterosis?
Sure. One of the common comments is that really heterosis only exists in first generation crosses. And so we'd like to get your opinion. What's your view? Do we only get heterosis in first crosses? And you can respond true or false to our poll here. Again, text EPDs to 22333 if you've not already joined the polling exercise. And then just respond A or B here, A for true or B for false.
Looks like we still have a few people responding, so go ahead and get your responses in as quick as you can. Looks like we're slowing down, so let's take a look at those poll results. False.
100% false. Excellent.
Wow, very astute. All right. So although you already know the answer to this question, let's go ahead and look at this in a graphical form. So on the top of this slide, you see the same example that we just looked at. And this next example is actually a back cross. So we've got our Angus bull again on the left, and we've got the F1 female from the first example that's now going to be our female that we're mating to. So the progeny will be a first generation back cross. And what we see is that we do have some places in the genome where we have Angus alleles with Angus alleles. So we've lost heterosis in those portions of the genome, but we still have heterosis remaining in about 50% of the genome. Now, if we look at another example of this, we might mate 2 F1s together. So a Sim Angus 50% and a 50% Sim Angus female as well, mate them together to create an F2. And we can see that some places in the genome we have Angus alleles with Angus alleles or simmental alleles with simmental alleles. So we've lost heterosis there, but we still have heterosis remaining in about 50% of the genome again. So from these examples, we can see that the mating of crossbred animals does result in the retention of some heterosis, because this is related to the probability of those alleles from those different breeds pairing together, and the alleles don't just disappear after that first generation of crossbreds. So we do want to note that the amount of heterosis that we expect and that we actually realize may be a little bit different due to the relationship between different breeds. But this brings me to another question that I've heard quite a few times, and that is, can I cross unrelated lines within a breed, like a maternal Angus with a terminal Angus, and still get heterosis? So what do you guys think about this? If you think we can get heterosis with that situation, go ahead and reply with A. If you think we can't, go ahead and reply with B. Looks like we still have a few responses coming in. All right, slowing down a little bit. So let's go ahead and take a look at those results. Okay, so about pretty close to half and half, but about 55% think that we can do that and get heterosis. About 45% think that we can't. So our audience is kind of split. What does the research say, Bob?
Great, Megan. Well, the research says actually that heterosis, and partially by definition, but also partially through research, suggests that heterosis really isn't available from within breed matings. A number of years ago, Dr. Larry Keene from the Meat Animal Research Center did some really, I think, interesting work looking at estimating the genetic distances between breeds based on 50K genomic data through the 2000 Bull Project. And what this project did is really created this dendrogram that looks at the relationships between breeds. And in some cases, what you observe in the chart is really a clustering of breeds of similar types. And so if you look on the Solaire, Limousin, Charolais, Branvi, Simmental, and Gelbvieh all make a branch, which are traditionally the continental European breeds. Angus, Red Angus, and Key Angus, which is predominantly an Angus-based pedigree, make a branch that represents Angus. There's another branch that represents another British breed, Hereford, that's sort of branched into kind of the line one or the very inbred population within Hereford, but a Hereford branch. Maine Anjou and Shorthorn, which have had an appendix registry between those two breeds, make a branch that's here in the US and in Europe as well. And then you see another branch that's really got Brahman and the American breeds of Brangus, Beefmaster, and Santa Gertrudis, which are blends of British and continental breeds as well as Brahman, kind of on this divergent Brahman branch. And the branching and the length of the branch represents the amount of genetic difference between those various breed groups. And so what you see is Hereford, for example, and particularly line one Herefords, are very different, than Maine Anjou. A long branch to the joining point, but also very separate branches of that particular tree. Brahman, the most different, right? And we can think about sort of the speciation of domestic livestock in beef cattle. And we know that Brahman and the Bos Taurus breeds separated maybe 10 or 11,000 years ago is our estimate, and very genetically different. So the point here is really that breeds are relatively recent, at least as we think about the British and continental breeds, maybe a couple hundred years divergent, have generated a substantial amount of heterosis, not near as much as the Brahman to Bos Taurus, or Bos Indicus, Bos Taurus difference. And that suggests to us that, breeds that have, like, say, Angus and Red Angus, although we can detect they're different in terms of some of the genomics, really aren't different enough to generate heterosis. There's not substantial variation in the chromosomal material or the genetics of those individuals in terms of alleles to generate heterosis. I think one of the other interesting things about crossbreeding research is one of the most extensively researched topics in beef cattle. If you just go to Google Scholar, which is an index basically of scientific manuscripts, more than 13,000 references related to crossbreeding in beef cattle. So, Megan, I think it's pretty clear that we don't get within breed heterosis, but let's think about maybe some differences in heterosis across traits. And so one of the ones that we talk about a lot in our industry is improvement in carcass merit. And is that a trait that we see improvements in performance due to crossbreeding? So if you think that's true, this is a poll question for our audience. Yes, we see improvements due to crossbreeding because of heterosis, or do we see it because of breed complementarity, or so putting breeds together that make sense in our crossbreeding system, or lastly, that no, there's little benefit? So we've got lots of responses in, a few coming in. This group's pretty well participating here in the poll, and we appreciate that a bunch. About a quarter of you suggest that there is some benefit due to heterosis. A little more than 2/3 of you suggest yes, but because of breed complementarity. And lastly, about 5% of you say no, there's a little benefit. So Megan, earlier we talked and you made a reference to the relationship between genetic improvement due to traits that are under genetic control, and we'll use heritability to describe that, and its relationship with heterosis. And tell us a little bit about that, and then maybe tie that back to our carcass discussion here.
Yeah, absolutely. So the short answer to our poll question is yes, we can benefit from crossbreeding in terms of carcass improvement, but not always in the way that we may first think. So as you mentioned, there is a relationship between the level of heritability of a particular trait and the amount of heterosis or response due to heterosis that we expect to see. So if we think about our traits that are more lowly heritable, like fertility and longevity, reproduction-related traits that are really important in our cow herd, those tend to be lowly heritable traits. And what we see is that we get a pretty high response in terms of improvement due to heterosis. Our growth traits fall somewhere in the middle, and our carcass traits are generally going to be pretty highly heritable. And what we see in those is that we get a fairly low response due to heterosis. However, we learned at the beginning of this presentation that there's more to crossbreeding than just heterosis. And that, of course, is breed complementarity, where we're really trying to harvest the core strengths of those different breeds to complement each other and sort of end up with an end product that's better than either of the two breeds going into it on their own. And the idea here is that we want to cross breeds to make improvements in lowly heritable traits, as well as take advantage of breed complementarity in highly heritable traits and really optimize performance. And that's the core idea behind sort of using heterosis to match cows to the environment and using things like breed complementarity to really try and match our calves to the marketplace. So how does this work for end product traits, Bob?
Sure. So if we think about back to our clay center data, there's some really nice summary information about sort of through the germplasm studies there about the strengths of various breeds across a wide range of traits. And included in there is a discussion about end product and carcass merit traits. So these are traits that are typically what we would call moderate to highly heritable, so heritability is between 0.3 and 0.5 typically, meaning that somewhere between 30 and 50% of the variation that we observe between individuals is under genetic control. So we have lots of opportunity to make a genetic improvement through selection tools. But we see across those breeds substantial differences in a variety of carcass merit traits, particularly yield grade, so how much trimmable fat there is in relation to lean muscle tissue in those carcasses. So that's yield grade. The other primary attribute that we evaluate in carcasses is intermuscular fat or marbling that affects quality grade. So typically we use percent choice and prime as a summary measure of those animals' performance into the more valuable quality grades. And then of course sort of conformance traits. So yield grades 4 and 5 get substantial discounts in the marketplace typically when you exceed plant average. Standards are a marbling score, a quality grade related defect or deficiency related to marbling. So the very low marbling animals get a discount as well. And what we see is that there's substantial differences between the British breeds and the continental breeds for these two sets of traits. In general, the British breeds tend to have a little more carcass fatness, a little more subcutaneous fat, intermuscular fat as well. So they grade a little bit better in terms of percent choice and prime, but have more yield grade problems as those cattle finish the feeding period. Continental breeds, on the other hand, typically dual purpose kinds of breeds or carcass driven breeds in terms of red meat yield. So breeds like Simmental, Gelbvieh, Limousin, and Charolais, typically quite a bit higher yield grades, so more lean product in their dressed carcasses as a percentage, but typically don't grade quite as well in terms of intermuscular fat. what makes sense to me is, in terms of breed complementarity, is how do we combine these traits? Well, we combine them on a breed by breed basis to leverage those in the complementary strategy to optimize carcass performance for both quality grade and yield grade. So as we think about the effects then of heterosis, we see that there's a substantial effect both from or in crossbreeding due to heterosis, but also breed complementarity. And we can think about selection and how does, in a multi-breed genetic evaluation system, how do we account for the effect of heterosis in EPD calculation? And that's a really good question. And so one of our questions to you all is, are the effects of heterosis not included in EPDs? So again, the question to you is, the effects of heterosis are not included in EPDs. If you think that's a true statement, you can respond A, to our texting poll, or B, for false. We'll give you just a few seconds here.
Okay, looks like we've got a pretty good chunk of responses here. If you want to keep sending those in, feel free to. But let's go ahead and take a look at these results. Okay, looks like about 2/3 thinks that the effect of heterosis is not included in EPDs, and about 1/3 thinks that it is included in the EPDs. So let's take a look and see if we can answer this question. So this brings us to one of my favorite equations, and it's shown up on your screen here. So the idea here is that the phenotype of an individual is a combination of a few different effects, including things like contemporary group effects. Of course, we have effects due to the genetic merit of an individual, and of course, variation that we can't explain with those other two things. And so the genetic merit portion of this equation, being a geneticist, is always one of the things that I'm very interested in. And interestingly enough, we can actually sort of partition this equation out and expand it and make it a little bit more informative to answer this particular question. So let's take a look at that expansion here. Okay, so that G term is actually a combination of a few different things. I, in that equation, is really the interaction of genes at different places within the genome. But really the two effects here that directly answer this question are A and D. So A are typically our additive genetic effects, and these are reflected in our breeding values or our EPDs. And so that leaves our dominance effects, which are really about the pairing of different genes or alleles together. And that's really where we see impacts from heterosis and crossbreeding. So the way I typically think about this sort of question is that when we're thinking about genetic selection, we can really focus on those additive genetic effects by using EPDs or indexes to make selection decisions. And sort of that heterosis or that dominance piece, we can really get at that piece by using management of different types of mating systems. And the really interesting and fortunate thing about this is that this means that we can really take advantage of both of these effects in our different mating systems. So if you're a commercial cattleman, you really want to think about really focusing on both of these things. So we can focus on increasing genetic merit through use of EPDs and indexes in selection decisions, but also managing mating systems to take advantage of those non-additive effects and those benefits that we get from heterosis. And for seed stock producers, obviously additive genetic merit in EPDs is a huge deal in terms of what the product that's being marketed to your commercial customers. But one of the additional things that you may want to think about is sort of strategies that you can use to package that additive genetic merit in a way that really helps your customers exploit those non-additive effects. So that may be if you have customers that have terminal breeding systems, really focusing on creating the type of animal that works really well in that type of system that has excellent additive genetic merit for the traits that are important in that type of system. So Bob, what does all of this really mean in the context of the straight breeding versus crossbreeding discussion?
Sure, Megan, and I think the question we see a lot is people trying to wade through sort of the understanding of the trade-offs between a straight breeding system and a crossbreeding system. And I think that's a really important question for producers to answer, because it helps guide you down the path of both breed complementarity, and if that's important in your system, but also what is the value that you either capture through crossbreeding or you give away if you focus on a straight breeding system. And so I call this the crux of straight breeding, right? And it's understanding that do the benefits of selection for economically important or convenience traits within breed, i.e. straight breeding, outweigh the improvement of lowly heritable traits that we might gain via heterosis, particularly maternal heterosis. And the reality is that in our selection system, as you suggested earlier, we can have our cake and eat it too by including both additive traits, or EPDs, and selection indexes in our individual animal selection strategies, but then capturing those non-additive or heterosis effects that are really important for genetic merit improvement of lowly heritable traits via the breeding system that we implement. And so part of it's a system focus, and part of it's an animal focus, and really to get the most value out of those systems, either one, we need to put them together and utilize both the sort of selection tools in terms of EPDs and indexes, but also the breeding system design to capture the heterosis pieces.
All right, now Bob, we've discussed heterosis quite a bit this evening as being particularly important for lowly heritable traits. So why don't we go ahead and survey our audience and see where they really think the economic benefit lies for a commercial cow-calf producer. So if you want, go ahead and type in your result, your opinion here. So which of the following is the most economically important to a commercial cow-calf producer? Is it having crossbred calves, crossbred cows, crossbred bulls? Or, of course, we have the choice that crossbreeding isn't economically viable or economically important. So we'll give you a few seconds to go ahead and type in an answer for that. All right, got a few people still answering here. All right, we're slowing down quite a bit, so let's go ahead and look at the poll results here. So it looks like the two places that people think have the most economic impact would be crossbred calves and crossbred cows. We got a few people saying crossbred bulls as well. Bob, why don't you tell us a little bit about the economics of crossbreeding?
Yeah, so this is actually, Megan, one of them, as you know, I'm a cow guy. I'm a cow-calf extension specialist, and so understanding the application of various technologies in cow-calf production, something that I'm really excited about, and heterosis really falls kind of at the center of a lot of those discussions because of its ability to generate value. And so some of the benefits, and this is a summary of data from the Meat Animal Research Center. This particular report was generated by Tom Jenkins. And what they did is looked at what is the improvement in weaning weight per cow exposed. So weaning weight per cow exposed turns out to be a really useful tool for us in cow-calf production to measure system level differences in production efficiency. And the reason we don't use just weaning weight is weaning weight by itself is only a reflection of all the things that went right in our production system. Weaning weight per cow exposed captures all of the failures in the system too. So cows that didn't conceive calves, or calves that died in utero, calves that died pre-weaning, all those sort of things get pushed into this sort of system level metric of improvement in weaning weight per cow exposed. So it's really the right tool to look at in terms of evaluating these differences in system level production efficiency due to crossbreeding. And what we find is that we use straight bred cows and straight bred calves, so 0 heterosis is our baseline. And we know that if we use a different breed of bull on straight bred cows of a different breed, so a 2-breed system here, but both purebred parents, we see about an 8% improvement in weaning weight per cow exposed, which isn't small. That's a substantial improvement. But what we find is nearly a double the improvement, so about a 23% total weaning weight improvement per cow exposed, if we actually produce crossbred calves born to crossbred cows. So this would be, say, a terminal sire F1 system, where the sire breed of the calves is not represented in the cows, so kind of 100% maternal heterosis, 100% individual heterosis of the calves. We see about a 23% improvement in weaning weight per cow exposed. Interestingly, this is one of the lower estimates in the data. The harsher environments that you measure these data points in, say the Gulf Coast or the desert Southwest, these improvements in weaning weight per cow exposed actually get substantially bigger. And in fact, in Bos Taurus by Bos Indicus crosses, we see nearly a 50% improvement in weaning weight per cow exposed. But roughly about 2/3, kind of the number we use as a rule of thumb, about 2/3 of the economic value of crossbreeding comes from having crossbred cows. So if you only produce crossbred calves from straight bred cows, you miss about 2/3 of the free lunch. Okay, so some of the individual numbers that sort of go behind this, I think are interesting and really point us to where those improvements are coming from. So if we look at some of the other pieces of information that contribute to that overall improvement in weaning weight per cow exposed, longevity, so crossbred cows in the same environment to their straight bred counterparts last about 1.25 years longer in the production cycle. They have about 1 calf on average more than their straight bred counterparts. This data published in the late 1990s from data primarily collected in the 80s suggested about a 600-pound cumulative additional weaning weight produced by those crossbred cows over their straight bred counterparts. So a pretty substantial improvement, largely driven by longevity, which we can think about under a uniform culling strategy of culling open cows, comes from that improvement in reproductive performance, which we all know is one of those lowly heritable traits, Megan, that you talked about earlier. But we know from production research, fertility, the ability for a cow to have a calf every year for a long period of time, is central to profitability in cow-calf production. If we think about the improvements or the advantages of crossbred calves over their straight bred counterparts, here's a few of the traits. So calving rate. So crossbred calves survive their in utero experience about 3.2% better calving rate out of those crossbred calves over their straight bred counterparts. Survival to weaning about 1.5% more. About a 1.7 pound increase in birth weight. So that one we talked about earlier from Dr. Spangler's work actually is narrowed up a little bit from this earlier research. Weaning weight, about a 16-pound improvement, or about 4%. Slight improvements in average daily gain and efficiency, about a 30-pound increase in yearling weight. Again, about 4%. So as a rule of thumb, we can kind of use about a 4% improvement in growth rate for the typical growth traits for the individual calf, and about a 4% maternal effect on weaning weight for having a crossbred cow. So about an 8% improvement in weaning weight, crossbred cows, crossbred calves. Okay. One of the things to think about is a technology adoption strategy, and one I think is illustrated really well in crossbreeding, is as a technology, it's one of the few that we can see a simultaneous impact in a return on investment through an increase in revenue and decrease in costs. And a good example of this is replacement females, Megan. So if we think about a cow herd that lasts longer, is more reproductively efficient, over time we need fewer replacement heifers if we keep the herd size constant. Okay, the beauty of that is that cull heifers go where? They go to town with their steer mates into the beef value chain and generate additional revenue for the operation. Simultaneously, we get to decrease costs. If we've needed or required fewer replacement heifers, we decrease costs of that cost center, which we know in cow-calf production, replacement heifers are one of the biggest cost centers in our system if we do enterprise accounting. And so simultaneously, by using heterosis to improve reproductive efficiency and productivity of our cow herd, we increase revenue, decrease costs, in one part related to replacement heifers. There's other examples of this as well. So a great opportunity for us to improve profitability in our production system. One of the things that I think is really interesting in thinking about heterosis is, if you remember back to our slide on the advantages of crossbred calves, most of those improvements were single-digit percentage changes in performance, which individually don't seem like a lot. But if we think about doing this exercise on a fairly large number of animals over a long period of time, it has really substantial impacts on ranch level profitability. So a few years ago, I put together this example and try and keep it updated with current market prices to illustrate this example. So here's a cow herd of just 100 cows, modest reproductive performance, so about an 80% weaning rate, which is not much different than the typical NOMS data for herds in the Midwest and Southeast part of the United States. On average, 575-pound average weaning weights. And we'll look at a 10-year time horizon, okay? So I would say this is kind of an average or modest kind of producing cow herd. If we think about the calf survival to weaning, about a 6% improvement due to crossbreeding. Over that 10-year time frame, about 48 head of additional calves available for marketing. That's about 2/3 of a potload of calves. Weaning weight, so just the individual calf part is 4%, so that's about 18,000 pounds of additional calf weight, not inconsequential. If we think about the weaning weight per cow exposed number, so we capture the reproductive efficiency part, calf survival, and performance to a weaning endpoint, a crossbred herd that's, say, a F1 terminal sire system would produce about an additional 106,000 pounds of calf weaning weight in that 10-year time frame, just due to heterosis. This doesn't count the breed complementarity part that we could add to this by making sensible breed selections. This is just the heterosis part. And that's equivalent to producing about 18 additional calves per year in that production system. If you go and sort of back figure what that's worth in terms of calf productivity in today's calf market, that means the crossbreeding system generates the heterosis part about $150 per cow per year in additional revenue, which is I think for many people a pretty surprising number, but it's even more surprising if we think about the context of sort of benchmarking and profitability across the cow-calf sector. If you look at the CattleFax data, this $150 would move you from the bottom 25% of producers for profitability to the top 25%, which is a pretty big move in terms of kind of how you're positioned relative to your peers in terms of efficiency. A common question I get, though, is, well, you know, I'm going to sell straight bred calves into some premium marketplace. How much additional value do I have to capture to make the two systems equal? And that's not $150, right? So the $150 is based on those crossbred cows' additional reproductive performance. If we look at it from a straight bred standpoint, those calves, because we wean fewer of them, actually have to generate more dollars per head than their crossbred counterparts to be equal. And that number is actually about $200 a head to be equivalent. So think about the crux of straight breeding talk we had earlier. If I'm going to try and capture a lot of value through a straight breeding system, I would have to capture about $200 per head additional for every calf marketed to be equal in terms of revenue generating capacity due to heterosis as the crossbreeding system. Okay, so that's I think sometimes a big number. Another way to think about this is on 100 cows, that's the ability to pay cash for a brand new Ford, Dodge, or Chevy crew cab dually loaded up pickup cash every 3 years. That's how big an economic difference this can generate in a relatively small herd. Okay, so another question sometimes we can think about is, well, we know breeds have changed a lot over time, and what consequence might that have to our ability to use them in crossbreeding?
So let's take that question to our audience and see what they think. So as breeds have gotten more similar, do we still get benefit from crossbreeding? Do we think that's yes or no? If you think that's yes, go ahead and text in A. If you think no, text in B. Do we still get a benefit from crossbreeding? Yes or no? All right, got quite a few responses in here, so let's go ahead and look at our poll results. 98% of our audience thinks yes, we still get a benefit from crossbreeding.
Yep, that's right, Megan. As we go and look at the data, it's pretty clear this is a crossbreed EPD adjusted genetic trends for weaning weight based on the crossbreed EPD adjustment factors from Clay Center. We see that the breeds have gotten better, or gotten more similar, let's say. They've all selected for more weaning weight. In general, those lines have gotten a little closer together, but there's still really substantial breed differences across not only weaning weight, but a number of other traits as well. And so maybe the key takeaway here is that we can still capture the heterosis and breed complementarity effects. In some cases, though, it's important to recognize maybe change in rank. So how much complementarity between breeds might have changed some over time, but certainly the heterosis bit we can still leverage as much today as ever. That's illustrated again here in sort of the changes we've observed in breeds. This is some data again from the Meat Animal Research Center, but really over two different time eras. Cycle 1 and 2 data collected in the early 1970s, the initial part of the germplasm evaluation project, and then some later data collected in the late 1990s, early 2000s, so cycle 7 data. And one of the interesting things is we've seen substantial changes in the breeds, both for sort of cow size. That's the metric that we're looking at. So on the left is Angus Hereford, Hereford Angus crossbred cows, Red Angus Simmental, Gelbvieh Limousin, and Charolais. The red bars represent the old cycle 1 and 2 data, the blue cycle 7. One of the things to take out of here is that some of our maybe older preconceptions about what breeds are and what they do has changed over time, partially due to selection, right? So historically, Hereford and Angus cows were kind of the smaller cows in terms of mature weight. Now they're about equal, if not maybe slightly bigger than some of their continental breed counterparts. And so sometimes getting our head around differences in breeds and what they do now versus maybe what they did in the 1970s or 80s is a really important part of taking advantage of the breed complementarity part. So making sure you understand those breed ranks and breed differences is really key.
Well, I think if I had to summarize the things we've talked about thus far, I think I would say that heard a lot about a lot of different benefits we can get from crossbreeding from both heterosis and breed complementarity. So why don't we think a little bit about what are some of the perceived barriers to different types of crossbreeding systems or different types of mating systems. So let's survey the audience. Which of the following do you think are the biggest challenges when we think about crossbreeding? So potential for decreased uniformity, A. That it's just difficult to choose a particular mating system, B. Maybe too much management required to implement a particular mating system. If you think that, check C. Or maybe just choosing the right bulls to really fit that goal and that mating system. That would be choice D. So if you would, go ahead and text in those results, or you text in those answers. All right, looks like we've got a pretty good number here. So let's maybe look at the poll results. Feel free to keep texting in answers if you want to. Okay, well, pretty good distribution here of answers. Maybe a little bit weighted towards choosing the right bull to fit my goals. So All right, well, how about we sort of break down, since we've got a pretty good distribution in each of these categories, why don't we break down each of these topics and explore them just a little bit? So let's kind of start with the first one. Will I sacrifice uniformity or marketability of calves by adopting a crossbreeding system?
Yeah, great question, Megan. And I think this is a chart that has been around for a long time, produced again by the Meat Animal Research Center, that looks at the differences in variation between progeny produced in different mating systems. So we'll start at the very top, and this represents maybe two breeds that are divergent for a trait. Say it's weaning weight, right? They're really different in terms of their genetic merit for those traits. If you look at the width of those, so they're each bell curve is kind of the same shape, and additive genetics provide that. We know those are fairly constant both across breeds and across time, even though there's been some substantial selection. If we take those two breeds and consider them as, the populations that they represent and their contribution to the whole beef industry, that's a lot of variation, right? We know that if we look at one of them, it's a reduction of that variation. But certainly we know there's more than one breed economically important to beef production in the U.S. And so we've got, as an industry, to get our arms around that wide variation, which we know has over time been a little bit of a challenge for us. If we think about the variation of calves produced by a two-breed rotational crossbreeding system, so a fairly common system for moderate and larger size producers, you can still see that there's influence of the two breeds, so the two peaks of those distributions, but the total width of them is actually narrowed, right? We've sampled genetic material from those parent breeds that narrows the distributions and gets them closer to that middle point. The very bottom one, I think, is a really interesting one, and it's the idea that if we sample and produce F1s out of the two purebred parents at the very top and look at the variation of those F1s, they're actually no more variable than either of their purebred parents. Or if we rotate different F1 bulls or breeds of bulls and cows together, they produce that same amount of variation as their purebred parents. So I'm a lefty, so I like these kinds of pictures. If you're a numbers person, this next one's a summary of the data that was used to support that particular set of graphs. And at the Meat Animal Research Center, they looked at the genetic variation between the purebreds and the composite populations that they produced. And those are mostly four-breed composites. So you think lots of variation, right? But it turns out that they're very, very similar within standard error of measurement, in fact, for these different groups across traits. So really no difference in the genetic variation we observe between purebreds and crossbreds or composite animals. So kind of continuing our discussion, maybe let's think a little bit about the next category of choosing the right mating system. Okay, so about 20% of you identified that as a pretty big challenge. And I think that's a pretty astute observation. Megan, tell us, how do we start to systematically think about which breeding system is right for your operation, and how do we sort of go through that thought process?
Sure, Bob. So in my mind, there are several things that are really important to consider when we're thinking about choosing which breeding program really fits our goals. The first of those is, do we want to be profit or premium focused? And when I say profit focused, I'm sort of thinking about cow-calf profitability and using that heterosis to increase our profitability in the cow-calf herds, or premium focused, where we're thinking about fitting calves to market targets, maybe a premium-based marketing system. But I think the key thing here is we don't necessarily have to choose one thing or the other. We can actually focus on both, and crossbreeding can help us do that when we focus on both additive and non-additive effects. The second consideration is, of course, herd size. Depending on how big your herd is, certain types of mating systems are going to be easier to implement than others. And within sort of that same discussion is some thought about using bull resources efficiently. So bulls can breed a certain number of cows, and we want to, if we're going to purchase a bull, we want to make sure that we're utilizing him effectively, and also thinking about the amount of variation that we're creating in those marketing groups, similar to the uniformity discussion that Bob just talked about. So if we're generating replacement heifers, we also need to think about that, because we're going to have different needs in terms of the types of traits that are important when we're generating replacement heifers versus a strictly terminal system where we're not keeping or generating any replacement females out of that system. Another question is, of course, where do we intend to market these calves? Are we marketing at weaning? Are we retaining ownership and marketing those calves later on a grid? And finally, but certainly not the least important, would be constraints that we may have. And those I sort of think of as two primary categories, either being environmental constraints or management constraints. So we might have environmental constraints like availability of forage resources, and we may have management constraints like if we happen to work a job all day, we might not be as tolerant of certain difficulties like having difficulty if we have a second job. So we may have managed both environmental and management constraints that really dictate what type of breeding system makes the most sense for us. So if we think about tying this together, one of the common approaches to mating systems seems to be to try and find one bull that sort of does everything, right? So a bull that we can use to generate replacement females that also does a good job producing calves that we can market that have excellent carcass merit or market characteristics. And that's actually sometimes can be difficult to do, because we have to deal with things like genetic antagonisms that can make that a more difficult proposition. So one of the things that we could think about instead, or may want to think about, is really separating maternal and terminal mating decisions and components within a mating system. So here, instead of trying to find one bull that sort of fits both of those two disparate pieces of what we're trying to accomplish in the cow herd and for marketing, we could think about having a bull that really focuses on maternal characteristics and traits really important in the cow herd to use to produce replacement females. And then we might have another bull or a set of bulls that we really use in a terminal portion of our mating system to really be focused on those market targets. And so in the prior system where we're trying to have one bull to do it all, sometimes we have to make compromises in terms of fitting both of those components of the system. Whereas if we can separate those out and really find specialist bulls to do both of those two things, it gives us a little bit more flexibility in the selection decisions that we have to make. So let's think about how all of this can fit together into a seamless approach. Bob, why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So I think one of the challenges in crossbreeding, and you talked about sort of the managerial component as being sometimes a challenge, and that's really focused on how do we decide what to do, how do we implement that, and so one of the things to think about is really what are the mating system goals. And so we've outlined 4 of those here to sort of maybe help guide you to the right system and how to sustain and maintain that system. And one of those is optimize. So optimize the utilization of calf and maternal heterosis. Notice we didn't say maximize, because in some cases the trade-offs between managerial or breeding pasture or bull utilization say, well, maybe we should use one crossbreeding system over another that doesn't maximize heterosis but allows us to still capitalize on some heterosis in the breeding system, and that's important. Second here, utilize breed complementarity. So I like the idea of how do we best match our cows to our production environment, and then use the breeds that help us do that to build breed complementarity for maternal traits and maternal heterosis, and then what breed or breeds might we use as the terminal type bulls to produce calves to get them in the right market segment. Okay, minimize here. So minimize variation in progeny phenotype by stabilizing breed inputs. So historically, one of the big criticisms of crossbreeding related to variability is been sort of type, kind, coat color issues related to using lots of different breeds over time in a breeding system. And that's sort of crossbreeding circa 1977 versus crossbreeding circa 2018. And so with some planning and some selection tools, it's really easy to keep them all one color and all polled and so forth, but still have crossbred calves. Lastly, think about ways we might use complementary technologies to implement our breeding system. For example, maybe we know that we're going to AI maybe all of our heifers and 2-year-old cows. How might we target them as the replacement generators in our system to do a very precise mating using AI or perhaps even gender sorted semen to produce those high quality replacement heifers. So maybe subtly at the very beginning we talked, and maybe you noticed as the viewers, our introductory slide picture was a group of sort of multicolored rainbow calves. That's not our goal in crossbreeding, right? Our goal is to produce really high value, high profit calves, sort of the ones maybe on the left. You notice they're all kind of black baldies, similar breed composition, presumably similar type and kind, certainly have more value in the marketplace than sort of the rainbow colored ones on the right. Okay. So other breeding systems. So many of you are probably thinking, well, what breeding system's right for me? And this is perhaps maybe one of the biggest challenges in crossbreeding, is sort of sitting down and working through that set of questions that Megan outlined earlier, and understanding the interactions of management and herd size and bull utilization, and let that guide you towards the crossbreeding system that makes sense. So in some cases, it might be strictly a terminal system where I buy crossbred cows and I mate them to a 3rd breed bull. It's easy and simple. F1 hybrid or composite seed stock are becoming a very popular tool to generate both breed complementarity and heterosis, and a really simple to deploy package for small and medium-sized producers. And lastly here, if you're a large producer, maybe that runs 2 or 3 or 4,000 cows that are divided up into breeding units, rotational systems are actually very easy and effective to implement, but you need to be big enough to take advantage of those sort of constraints to put them to your advantage to produce semi-load lots, say, of calves out of each one of those systems. The 2 overriding goals, though, in any of these breeding programs are capturing as much retained heterosis in your cows as you can, and then likely stabilizing breed percentages so that all the calves that come out of one part of the system are very homogeneous in terms of their breed percentages, and that'll add to the value of those calves in terms of their uniformity in type and kind.
So let's go back again to our original survey question, and the next topic on the list refers to the amount of management required to make a system work properly. And that's definitely an important question because we need to find a system that works with whatever our desired level of management is. So with that, Bob, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the systems we have available and the benefits and constraints of those systems?
Yep, so this is a table that our National Beef Cattle Evaluation Consortium team borrowed from Dr. Harlan Ritchie, who was at Michigan State for a long period of time, and really, I think, does a great succinct job of dividing up the different breeding systems and sort of presents it in a way for us to sort of go through and logically decide which system works best for us. So here in green, we'll talk through a few of these, but it's a different type of system. So, you know, is it a 2-breed rotation? Is it a terminal cross with F1 cows, composites, whatever? So those different breeding systems. In the middle here in blue is the advantage, and the advantage here is reported in weaning weight per cow exposed. So how much system level improvement in production efficiency do we expect, and how much retained heterosis then do we get to capture in our cows principally. And then lastly here, the purple part over on the very right describes the constraints of those breeding systems. So what's the minimum number of breeding pastures you need to implement the system effectively? And you can think about these as either real or virtual, right? If you use AI, die, you can supplant one or more of these breeding pastures depending on how you manage those cows and are able to identify them. Herd size, of course, and that's primarily a reflection of the number of bulls and breeding pastures that might be required. Of course, how many breeds is defined typically by those different systems. So we'll talk through a couple of examples here real quick. So we'll start off the 2-breed rotation. So you know, the amount of cows involved in that, you can have 100% of the cows devoted to the rotational system. You market all the calves out of those. About a 16% improvement in weaning weight per cow exposed, about a 2/3 or 67% retention of heterosis. Of course, 2 breeds typically requires 2 pastures at least, and probably if we think about minimum herd size, if we're going to split it in half, 1 cow to 25 bulls, 2 different breed groups to make that happen. You know, if we think down to sort of a simplified system for a small breeder, you know, using a 2-breed or F1 composites, a popular choice. Those are really single sire breeding or single breed breeding pastures. We bring the bull into the system that's got heterosis and breed complementarity built in, really scalable across size, can be very effective. We can also think about these breeding systems as being not necessarily done parallel, but scaled in time. So, you know, rotating different breeds of bulls every 4 years is kind of like a 2-breed rotation, but done in time, not in space. And so can have pretty substantial benefits for particularly small and medium-sized breeders as well. So Megan, let's we've got a couple of illustrations here. The rotation ones sometimes are systems that are harder for producers maybe to get their head around. I know it takes a little bit of thinking to figure out who goes where. And Megan's got a couple of illustrations to help us think through those.
Sure, I'm going to go ahead and get this started. So even if we think about a 2-breed rotation where we're starting with purebred females, we can mate them to a bull of a different breed, and then we continue to mate the offspring to the breed of bull with which they share the smallest breed fraction. So we continue down that process, and once the breed percentages have stabilized, we sort of have 2 main groups of females, which are analogous to our 2 breeding pastures with slightly different breed composition. And from here, the rotation simply involves placing a bull of breed B with the females that are a higher percentage of breed A, as we see here, and vice versa for the other group. And then replacement females produced in each separate pasture are simply moved to the other pasture to keep the rotation going from 1 year to another.
So we don't really move bulls, we move replacement heifers, right? They go to their separate respective breeding groups to the cows that are like them in terms of breed composition.
Exactly. And so a 2-breed rotation is a great approach, and it's a really good option. However, if we can manage a slightly greater level of complexity, and we have the herd sizes and of course the resources to make that work, we can get substantially greater benefit as a result of being able to sort of separate those maternal and terminal components like we talked about earlier. And so let's take a look at that. Here we've got the 2-breed rotation set up just as it was before, where we've got replacement heifers rotating between those 2 different pastures so that they're being bred to the bull that shares the smallest amount of breed composition. And so the way to sort of set up the terminal piece of that is frequently we may want to take the older cows from pasture A and pasture B and move them into a separate location and mate those cows to a bull of a different breed that they don't share any ancestry with. And from there, that bull would be really focused on terminal and market characteristics. So all of those progeny are going to go into the marketplace. So we sort of produce our replacement females from the rotation portion of the system. And we really focus on those later mating decisions in the terminal portion on really fitting those market targets. And as Bob talked through that table before, you can see that there are lots of other options. And if you're interested in learning more about those, I'd suggest you check out that NBCEC sire selection manual, because it talks in detail about each of those systems, and we don't unfortunately have time to do that this evening. But so Bob, let's sort of think about how this works in the context of our 4 S's that were on the very first slide in this presentation.
Yeah, this might be maybe the part of the really impactful part of our talk, and it's how do we do this right? So there's lots of moving pieces, and our advice really is, one, keep it simple, right? We know that the things that are simple to implement, you're more likely to continue to do over time. And so when you've got the opportunity to choose a system that works very effectively in your program and breeding operation in terms of inputs, pick the simplest one, because you're more likely to be successful with it over time. Structured. So I think the structure part of structured crossbreeding can't be overemphasized. This isn't rotating bull of the month club. This is having a plan. So sitting down, working with resources available in terms of extension, folks like Megan and I, to sort of work through and figure out the plan and what the goals are of your operation is a really important part of that. And the considerations that Megan had pointed out earlier in terms of market endpoints, replacement female generation, environmental constraints, managerial constraints, all play a really key role in which one of those structured systems makes sense. In terms of sustainability, two pieces. One is it's sustainable because you stick to it and you do it repeatedly year after year. So building that plan and sticking with it is really important to making the process work. Few of these systems can you implement and see the results in 1 year. Purchased F1 females terminal sire, absolutely you can. A 2-breed rotation with a terminal sire, it's going to take a while to get that whole system in play unless you buy some females into the system to sort of jumpstart it. That's really important. The other part about sustainability really is the idea of improving production efficiency. We know we get 23% more or less kind of outputs from the same resource inputs. Crossbred herds are more sustainable in terms of our resource utilization and certainly have improved profitability options moving forward. That sort of speaks to the last bit in terms of being successful. We think that increasing profitability and revenue stream helps ranches be sustainable as business units, and certainly improvements in production efficiency translates into improved profit for our cow-calf producers. So as a kind of a follow-up question, the last bit here was number D, or the bottom entry, was choosing the right bulls to fit our goals. And that's really an important question, Megan, for us to think about. How do we pick that right bull?
All right, so the first decision, once you've really chosen that mating system, is the breed that's going to work the best within that system. So if we think about this, we need to pick the right breed based on not only our planned mating system, but also the objectives and sort of goals that we have for our outputs, keeping in mind those different constraints and considerations for our system. Yep.
And the second part of that really is the one that maybe many of us really like to do, and it's the how do I go pick the right bull, right? The right individual from those breeds to fit in that planned crossbreeding plan. And we know we've got lots of useful tools in terms of EPDs and accuracies and selection indexes to help point us towards those right selection candidates that help sort of make our crossbreeding plan come to life.
And I don't know about you, Bob, but every show I watch seems to end on a cliffhanger to get me to tune in again next time for the next episode. And we're going to do a little bit of that here tonight, and invite you to tune in next month to really hear the final part of this series, where we focus on trying to tie everything that we've talked about in the 3 different sessions up to this point and tie all that together to really focus on how to select the right bull for several different types of scenarios. So I'd encourage you to sign up for that session if you have interest in that, and it looks like from our survey result that there's a lot of interest in that. So please consider signing up for that. When you do, you're going to receive a bull catalog or a link to download a bull catalog along with some scenarios when you sign up for that 4th session.
So a little homework to do.
Yes. So if you would take a little bit of time to pick out the bulls you think make the most sense to you within those different scenarios. And we're going to actually all come together as an eBeef team and discuss those different scenarios with all of you during the April 19th session. So with that, I'd just like to thank all of you for turning in. I apologize we went just a little bit long here, but we will turn this back over to you guys.
Thank you to both our presenters for a great session tonight. NCBA is all about bringing producers together for important discussions, and the EB team has certainly helped us achieve that goal tonight. As we move into our question and answer session, I want to remind everyone to sign up for the next webinar in this series we just talked about, Putting the Tools to Use, Buying Your Next Bull. Registration will open tomorrow, March 23rd at beefusa.org. NCBA is also hosting a webinar highlighting a recent report by World Perspectives Incorporated about cattle traceability and ID. Registration is now open for that, and the webinar will be held on April the 3rd. Visit ncba.org for more details. Now let's get to your questions. Thank you again for participating in tonight's webinar. Josh, I'll hand it over to you for the question and answers.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks for joining us to help facilitate tonight. And Bob, I'll start off the questions with a couple that are related, I think, and go back, and you're welcome to jump back onto the control of the slide deck if you want to scoot around within the slides as we go through these. One question about heterosis between line 1 Herefords and polled Herefords, and then another that seems to be related, talking about sort of the difference between breeds or within breeds, back to the question of, you know, can I make similar improvements within a breed with all of the different options and genomic testing, EPDs and indexes available out there? How much more quickly can I really move my herd using crossbreeding versus just selection within a breed?
Okay, great questions, Josh. I'll hit the first one. Was the sort of, can I capture heterosis from line ones versus polled Herefords? And unfortunately, the answer is no. We saw on the genomics data those animals appeared, when it was actually in that dendrogram, horned Hereford and line 1, and some differences, but a lot of that difference was driven by the inbreeding of the line 1s and sort of that subset population. So they look genomically different, but what we see in practice is that we really don't get any benefit. I think it was slide 17 there, Josh. I saw it go by. There we go. You know, we really don't see that heterosis effect across those sort of segregated breed lines. So even if you go, you know, and Angus is a really big population. If you go to the far corners of Angus and put those lines together, you really don't get heterosis in the way that we observe it when we say cross Hereford and Angus, for example, because those genetic distances are much further apart than those within breed lines. Now I'm trying to remember the second part of the question.
I think you basically answered. I think you basically answered both of them with that, okay, with that one answer. And then we had another question, more about what Megan was talking about. In the EPD formula, you described one of the coefficients, but not the others. And so there was a question about defining U or explaining U and E.
Sure. Looks like you're already headed back there. Yeah, that one. Perfect. I will just kind of get our labels up there. Okay, perfect. So sort of that first term, the mu, refers to looking at effects of contemporary groups. So one of the things that's really important when we turn in data for, you know, EPD generation and genetic evaluation at the breed associations is that we do a good job defining our contemporary groups. And the reason for that is they sort of form the basis of where we start, and we look at deviations in performance of animals from that contemporary group average. So that first piece is looking at what is the effect of the contemporary group where we've managed those animals similarly, and that's sort of our baseline.
Think of it as average performance of a group of calves.
Yeah.
Yep.
So from that point, then we would have a deviation due to the genetic merit, which we talked about. And then we may also have unexplained variation. So that's that E component. So these might be things in the environment that affected performance that isn't a genetic effect, but is something that sort of has an effect on the phenotype, but isn't really tied to the contemporary group or directly to the genetic merit of that individual.
Think subclinical bovine respiratory disease in a calf that causes him to weigh 10 pounds less than he would have if he got sick. And if you didn't know about it, it goes in the unexplained part.
Excellent. And then another question, Bob, you may want to take this one about, you know, what are the chances of getting some better selection tools such as EPDs or other tools for crossbred bulls to make this a little simpler on the selection side of the crossbreds?
Yeah, great question. And one actually that I'm you know, not often do animal breeders sort of read the tea leaves and prognosticate fast enough to keep up with practice and implementation. But we've actually in a number of breeds now in the U.S., principally some of the continental breeds that have had open herd books that have used substantial amounts of, say, Angus and Red Angus genetics, actually have very effective multi-breed genetic evaluation systems that account for both breed difference and heterosis in calves of multi-breed lineage. And those systems now kind of, most of those breeds that are doing that work under the sort of the IGS banner and have a data set that's the largest genetic evaluation for beef cattle on the planet. So about 16 million animals represented in that, and produces really useful and high accuracy and very, very good EPDs come out of that system based on you know, data coming from about 10 or 11 different breed associations pooling data. And so those tools exist today, both in EPD and index form for you know, crossbred or hybrids, composites, however you want to describe them, but animals of multiple breed inputs. Yeah, great question.
So there are also options for particularly larger commercial producers to do within herd genetic evaluation of animals within those same types of frameworks. So there are some opportunities to do things like that as well for within herd selection.
Yeah, Josh, I think you included sort of genomics at the end of that that question, and that's a really important piece as we move forward on selection systems in the U.S. and more broadly around the world. That the genomics information is becoming very, very useful, and under these multi-breed constructs with single-step evaluation, sort of avoid all the complexities of a lot of the training population structure and those things that we faced, you know, even just a couple of years ago, whereas if, you know, we had genomic predictions in Angus, we couldn't use those in Hereford and the like. If we wanted to do, say, Simmental and Sim Angus animals, we had to have a genomic training exercise that included Simmental, Sim Angus, and Angus all together to make that prediction equation work. The single step methods avoid much of that complexity. We still need lots of data from lots of breeds, but there's a simpler implementation that's really, really effective.
Great. And just might make a note that if you go back and look through our menu of past webinars last spring, we did one where we talked about some of the new EPD platforms and genomics, et cetera, and how they fit into that question. So quite a bit deeper on that. And you can find all that at our ncba.org. Another question here, how many crosses are too many crosses? You know, if, say their example is you cross up Hereford and Angus to make your cow herd, and then you go to a crossbred bull of, you know, potentially Bos Indicus and maybe Continental, and that way you get 4 differences, including 3 totally different types of animals. Is that, you know, can you get more value from that?
So you can certainly find lots of heterosis when you do that. When you combine four different breeds together into that final progeny, you can certainly capture heterosis when you do that. I think the key when you start to think about adding more breeds and more complexity is sort of how to manage that, and particularly in terms of replacement females. So, you know, if we've got the two breeds being used to produce the replacement females, and that's in maybe a rotation, and then we bring in an F1 bull with two different breeds to make a terminal cross, and we market those progeny, that may be one way to think about that. If we were to then try and capture replacement females out of that population and move them back into the rotation, we're sort of breaking that crossbreeding system and adding a lot of additional breed composition into that cross. But there are ways to make systems with four breeds work, and you also have four breed composite options as well. And I think those are on that table that Bob talked about at the end of the presentation. But that's also another option to have some additional breeds involved in those crosses in a way that makes a lot of logical sense.
Yeah, I think, Josh, from sort of practical experience and implementation of these systems, you know, somewhere between 2 and 4 usually gets the job done. It's rare to find somebody that's got a system that has, you know, a 5 breed or a 6 breed or an 8 breed system that's not a composite, particularly. So in our slide here, the table 7 that you pulled up out of the sire selection manuals, a good example. There's lots of variety in system here. The most breeds represented is 4. And my sort of predilections that if you can't do it in 4, you probably can't get it done. And in many cases, you can do it with 2. I think part of it comes down to, particularly if you're trying to separate the maternal and terminal components, what breeds do you put in there for breed complementarity, and where do you position those in the breeding system? And if you require maybe a system that's got, say, Angus in both the cow side of the population and say in an F1 terminal sire system, how do we structure those to get some extra heterosis in that, you know, one that's the third breed is different in the bulls than the cows. Those can be very, very effective and simple to implement. Just a little kind of creative twist on applications. So probably the biggest thing is pick the one that's the simplest that you can routinely and sort of habitually deploy and implement, is probably the best advice. So.
Yeah, that's great advice. There's a difference between theory and what will work on the ground.
Yep.
One final question here, and I think this table helps answer it as well. Would it be wise to retain some purebred cows in order to generate F1, since the effects of heterosis are greatest in that first cross?
Yeah, that's a good question, and part of it has to do, I think, with sort of the balance of what resources you have available, and how many cows you're talking. You know, if it's, I got to keep, you know, 4 purebred cows to generate 1 replacement heifer to go in, you know, my 20 cow herd of a specific breed composition. There's a lot of effort there and a lot of lost opportunity in 3 straight bred cows that you could capture in composite cows. So there's a balancing act there. You know, I think there's you know, systems where having a set of purebred cows makes some sense, but those are typically some of the much larger kind of systems where I've got a real opportunity and need to capture 100% maternal heterosis. You know, a sort of more modern way to do that is gender sort semen, right, and minimize the number of cows that are in that maternal part of the breeding unit that produces replacement heifers, and then, you know, allocate many more females to the terminal sire side of that system. So you can do that pretty effectively with AI. So yeah, great question, Josh.
All right. Well, I think everyone is probably heard enough for one night and ready to go watch some K-State basketball. So,
All right, go Cats.
Thank you both for a great presentation. Thank you to the audience for great interaction, and look forward to seeing you on our next webinar and the final webinar in the series later in April. And everyone have a great night.
Great. Thank you, Josh. Thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you.
Good night.